This is Pitafi World. I am Syed Shafaat Ali and you're watching Fault Lines. Bashar al-Assad secured a fourth term after winning 95.1% of the votes in the last month's presidential election. This was unsurprising. No serious observers expected a different outcome. The election only took place in the regime-controlled areas, where many Syrians are loyal to Assad. None of the 4.3 million displaced Syrians trapped in Idlib had a vote. The same was true for the Syrians living in the northeast. That, combined with Idlib, constitutes one-third of Syrian territory. Also excluded from the election were the 6 million Syrian refugees who have fled abroad. Contesting candidates were only given 10 days to campaign. One of them is a former state official. The question arises, why Syrian leadership needed this election at all? How can it help the war-broken country and its unfortunate inhabitants? What to expect from powers like Russia and America, who are the major stakeholders in the multilateral war? See how the international news media has covered this election. Watch the package made by Reuters.
Syrian state TV showed crowds gathered in the capital Damascus on Thursday as President Bashar al-Assad's election victory and his fourth term in power was confirmed. The head of Syria's parliament announced that Assad had got more than 95% of the vote and that turnout was 78%. On his election campaign page, Assad thanked Syrians for their, quote, high sense of nationalism and notable participation. But his opponents and the West have cried foul. The opposition boycotted the vote and said Assad's presidential rivals were deliberately low-key. Ahead of the election, France, Germany, Britain and the US said the vote would not be free or fair. Protests were also staged in Syria's last rebel enclave of Idlib, where hundreds on Wednesday denounced the vote as a charade. Syria remains in the midst of a war that's killed hundreds of thousands of people and driven 11 million, about half the population, from their homes. Assad's government said the election showed that Syria was functioning normally, despite the decade-old conflict. His win gives him 7 more years in power and lengthens his family's rule to nearly 6 decades. His biggest challenge, now that he has regained control of most of the country, will be an economy in decline. Tightening US sanctions, limited relief from allies Russia and Iran, and the global health crisis mean prospects for recovery look poor.
To join me in my program, my first guest is from Russia, Mr. Leonid Savin, editor-in-chief of Geopolitica, which is a famous website, and also he is a famous defense analyst from Russia. Mr. Savin, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Mr. Savin, we just saw that Assad regime has once again taken control and have won the election with a wide margin. This margin is 95%, too good to be true. What's your take on that?
First of all, I would like not to use term regime, because this term used mostly in the West countries, in the United States, by politicians, just to give a negative connotation to states and governments that follow their own policies and are not satellites of the United States. For example, we never heard about a regime about Gulf countries or about United Kingdom, but there's monarch rules, and for example in United Kingdom there no any constitution, for example. So it's kind of mimetic warfare. If we back to elections in Syria, Russia not interfere to domestic affairs of any countries. Yes, we can do some kind of informational analysis, and our Ministry of Foreign Affairs gives some message, but it's exactly domestic affairs in Syria, in Pakistan, in Turkey, or in any countries. So it's just we respect results of the elections, and our President Vladimir Putin already...
I'll stop you here. You made a very important point. Let me repeat what you said, and please correct me if I'm mistaken. You said that any monarchy or any administrative setup running a state is only called the word regime or given the word regime once United States and its allies refuse to accept it. And the monarchies that are under the patronage of United States are not called regime. Is that what you said?
Yes, exactly. Because the United States, just to use such terms like authoritarian regime and so on, and like a political frame, it's mimetic warfare, and they use it in the political context only. Mostly for the countries that kind of treat or enemy of United States, not for allies.
Okay, but Savin, the second part you said about Russia is that you just see is as an external observer and it's an internal affair of the government of Syria. But would you agree to the fact that without support from Russia, the government of Bashar al-Assad, I'm not using the word regime now, would not have been able to even stand its own feet? Do you agree to this or not?
Yes, of course, because Syria asked assistance from Russia to combat terrorism in Syria. Russia, Iran, and Lebanese Hezbollah, allies of governmental forces inside of Syria. We have presence there, military presence. We provided economical assistance, humanitarian assistance, and I think we are good partners with Syria. So, of course, without Russian support, it's not possible that Bashar al-Assad can still stay in power. I am agreed.
Savin, there are very serious allegations, again leveled by the Western media or the parties that are standing on the opposite side of the conflict, that the Russian Air Force has done horrendous crimes against humanity. Air Force has been used on civilian population. There is no number count of the people killed in this war. Are you supportive of this use of brute force to level playing fields, to level the fields for Assad administration?
If Russia or any other country already started involved in conflict, of course there will be civilian victims. It's at war. So it happens. But we have official organizations like International Criminal Court and Human Rights Commission inside the United Nations. So Western media cannot claim about any kind of military crimes or something like that. There were many special organized groups like White Helmets, and they organized direct provocations of fake news against Syria, against Russia, against other countries. And of course, terrorist organization also was very wise to organize propaganda inside the internet and outside, and just try to use this term of human rights violations just for our benefit. So of course, there need to be more investigations, but not only inside the parts of countries there was military conflict, but also outside, because the real fact of child prostitution inside of refugee camps in Turkey and in Jordan too, and many other types of violations. And also we need to remember that human rights narrative also is kind of lawfare of the West, and they use it very strongly against many countries, and also against Pakistan too.
Got your point. Now, many of the critics will say that Syria has become a battleground between United States and Russia, where Russia has finally refused to be taken aback or to be defeated or to be losing one of its key partners in the region. And this has become, perhaps after the first Cold War, it has become the first instance when Russian and American forces were facing each other in a one-on-one combat. And Russia maintaining its position now on a higher ground is actually a moral victory for the Russian government and Milosevic Putin and his administration. Do you agree with this remark?
It's rather proxy war, not direct battleground. And the most important that the red line was not crossed from both sides, from Russia and from United States. And our military generals communicated to each other during the operations in Syria, especially close to Turkish border, because there are also confrontation. For example, America supported Kurdish militants, and Turkey not like this position. And Turkey is a member of NATO, so it brings some tensions between Turkey and United States. Situation really very complex, and especially close to Turkish border, because there are many different groups living there. There is kind of religious division and ethnic division: Turkmen, Alawites, Kurds, Arabs, and so on. And of course, we are not happy that United States present there, because it's illegal presence. And I need to remind that Russia was officially invited to Syria just to assist to combat terrorism, and nobody invited United States there. And of course, will be better when United States troops will leave Syria as soon as possible.
Let me repeat what you just said in the end. You said United States was not invited, whereas Russia was formally invited by the Syrian administration, by the Syrian government, to support it against all the combatants. Now, it's another important point, and I have to read this one from the paper. It's published somewhere in a Western journal. And they say that the agreement made between the government of Russia and government of Syria allows Russia to keep a dozen warships, including nuclear-powered vessels, at Tartus. This will be one of the only naval facility outside former Soviet Union. So this will be a big news for the entire West, including the NATO countries that are all allies, and now they have Russia possessing the naval base of the Syrian government. How do you see that? This would be very challenging for the West.
Yes, exactly. Russia got first military base in Mediterranean, and of course we have also air base inside of Syria, base. But it's more a kind of restoration of Russian presence, because during the Soviet time we have more military bases abroad, not only in Syria but also in African coast, and also in Vietnam, in Cuba, and etc. So I think it's very good, and Russia got more experience inside Syria. It's kind of pragmatical questions, and our Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu already told that Syria was kind of lab for different types of Russian weapon systems, and Russia very succeeded just for this kind of experience and testing inside Syria. And of course, the geopolitical presence is very important. It's also a kind of message to other countries of the region that Russia back to Middle East, to Africa, and need to be presented. And I also read many message in Western media and Arabic media that for example, Gulf countries respect Russian presence because it's a kind of no double standards from Russian side, and it will be more a welcome Russia presence as a country after Syria.
International news media watches it a bit differently, Mr. Savin. And what they say is that Syria has become a strong foothold for Russia. In Iran, China is extending its economic muscle, its economic partnership. And then we have a great relationship or a great regional understanding between China and Russia. This all looks like building blocks against the United States. Your quick thoughts on that?
Exactly, yes. There is kind of block, but mostly political block, not military, and every side in the United States, Russia, and China understand it very well. And our relations between Russia and China is very good now. It's the most best during the whole history of our relations. And of course, we have joined our different kind of projects. For example, we have Eurasian Economic Union and China have a Belt and Road Initiative, and we started integration of these two projects to each other. And besides Iran, China also presented in Iraq, for example, and also in Israel. They have rent port in Haifa. And for example, Syria not recognize Israel, but a few days ago, China announced that can provide any kind of assistance to Syria too. So it's just the interest of China to extend Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia also can to extend our own initiatives and join it with China in this region. And I think it is good for the region because both countries not provide any kind of monopoly for foreign relations like United States do it.
Thank you very much, Leonid Savin, for being in my program live from Russia. And it's always a pleasure to have you in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, my second guest in the program is coming from New York. He's Mr. Tom O'Connor, a famous journalist from New York and also an analyst of South Asian region. Tom, welcome to the program. What do you think is the significance of this controversial election in Syria? I have seen your work. You recently wrote about it as well. Can you tell us a bit more about this election and its significance?
Hey, Shabahat. Thanks so much for having me. The elections in Syria are controversial for two main reasons. Firstly, that the many critics of the Syrian government contend that they were neither free nor fair, as candidates were extremely limited, and the results largely reflected the last 8 or so elections that favored President Assad or his father before him. And the argument that the vote does not conform with UNSC Resolution 2254, which calls for a political settlement in Syria among various parties. What the elections do, however, is reinforce a sense of dominance by Assad's government, which can now flaunt its power after a decade-long civil war that spanned periods in which the state of his rule and its immediate future were uncertain. Now, despite this, Assad has emerged on top and can hold an entire election just as he did in pre-war times, validating his power.
Tom, there are many skeptics, particularly in the Middle Eastern media, who say that US has done more damage than good. They have provided weapons, they have provided support, they have been overtly and covertly supporting the factions fighting against Assad. That has given Assad a justification to use violent means against his own people. What's your quick take on that?
The U.S. backed away from its regime change stance against Assad for a number of reasons, not the least of which was the U.S. experience post-intervention in other countries, including Iraq and Libya, both of which struggled to form a succeeding government, and in some ways still do, to varying degrees between them. There were times where the U.S. considered launching major strikes or toppling the Syrian government altogether, but they proved extremely unpopular domestically and entirely unpredictable strategically, especially as hardcore Islamist groups began to emerge out of the fractured Free Syrian Army rebel coalition that were counting on U.S. intervention at the time. The final nails in the coffin were probably the rise of ISIS and Russia's direct intervention in support of Assad. Since ISIS was largely defeated due to separate campaigns by both the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian government backed by Russia and Iran, these two parties are now the top brokers on the ground in Syria. And both sides right now have little appetite to fight one another, nor is there real enthusiasm in the U.S. to enter another war at a time when it's much more focused on what's going on in East Asia. This reality has in some ways allowed Assad to consolidate power with additional help from his foreign allies. But the country cannot be truly stabilized, nor can his government truly consolidate power until a resolution to the conflict is reached.
But as a consequence of all these American interventions or American efforts to set Assad administration aside, we now have the Russian heavy footstep in Syria that I was discussing a while ago with another guest from Moscow. And Moscow is pretty happy about it. We have Russia with a very heavy presence in Syria now. How do you think United States is going to like this situation?
The war in Syria proved an opportunity, certainly for Russia, to demonstrate its resurgence as a major power with the ability to project such power abroad, especially in the domain of the former Soviet Union's allies. But this story begins, however, with the U.S. interventions in Iraq and especially Libya, where a UN Security Council resolution back in 2011 paved the way for a no-fly zone, but it was ultimately used by Western powers to oust and then eventually kill Muammar Gaddafi. Since then, Russia has sought to act as a counterweight to U.S. moves in the region. And it's not actually necessarily its military might so much that makes it an attractive partner for regional countries, but its diplomatic prowess. Russia has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to speak with countries and actors on all sides of the region's many conflicts, be they Israeli, Palestinian, Iranian, Saudi. This emphasis on maintaining stability in a region so prone to unrest is welcomed by many regional leaders. What this concerns the U.S. Is Russia's newfound foothold in areas like the Mediterranean, which is also NATO's southern flank, and especially Russian arms sales, weapons such as the S-400, which the U.S. views very much as a competitor and even a security threat to its own attempts to sell weapons in the region.
Tom, United States always pursues the agenda of democracy, talks about human rights, and gives such build-up stories to get into the countries. Fact of the matter is that even today, when Syria does not have any other source of income, when it is under international economic sanctions, it is the American companies that are drilling oil from Syria. Do you think it's a justifiable action, stealing resources from a nation that is so resource-strapped?
The former Trump administration's shift in Syria policy toward drilling oil laid bare what many critics of U.S. policy in the Middle East had long alleged, that oil was a major factor in the U.S. military presence and intervention across the region. The truth is, Syria has relatively little oil and gas to begin with, especially compared to some of the other countries in the region. But these reserves are now largely under control of the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, which actually sell some of it back to the Syrian government, despite U.S. sanctions on Damascus. The Biden administration appears likely to allow the licenses granted to these U.S. companies to lapse, but the fate of these sites remain uncertain. And honestly, so does the Biden administration's long-term Syria policy. The true value of the U.S. presence here seems to be to retain leverage over the Syrian government, which faces frequent shortages and relies not only on buying from its rivals, but also outside support from Iran. Now, one possibility is that this leverage could be used to foster a reconciliation deal between the Syrian government and the Syrian Democratic Forces. But the two sides have so far repeatedly failed to reach a compromise. Until then, the continued U.S. presence here continues to serve as fuel for its critics who consider the U.S. an occupying power.
Thank you very much, Tom, for again being in my show. It's such a pleasure to have you every time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join back with the last segment of the program. Stay with us. In the last segment of my program, I have with me Mr. Farrukh Pitafi, who is a reputable journalist and an IR expert. He's also a host of Pitafi World's program. And I have with me Syed Shafaat Ali, a Pakistani journalist who is now working on various international conflicts and also started writing. Farrukh Sahab, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We're discussing the Syrian election where Bashar al-Assad has secured 95% lead. Your quick comments on that.
Well, the number itself is intriguing. The number is 95.1%. You're talking about a country whose, 10% people have been killed, half the population is internally displaced, and some 6 million people have left the country. They are refugees in other territories. In that country, holding an election and then getting this kind of support actually tells you of three things. One, that it is war by other means, because in the north, the war is still continuing. It is a rebuke of all the opponents who think that there is a possibility that Bashar al-Assad is gone or can go. The second aspect is, of course, Syria expects to be included in Arab League. So there too, it was a kind of diplomatic move. And the third thing is Geneva-based Constitutional Committee. It had announced that it can actually move up the elections under a new constitution. So there seems to be an attempt to undermine that as well. Bashar al-Assad is telling everyone that he is here to stay, and it is his terms that everyone will have to work with. Yeah.
But Farrukh, why this election at all? I mean, why did he need this endorsement? Why did he think of this election at the moment when his country is under chaos and crisis? There's no economy, there's no electricity, infrastructure destroyed, 4.5 million people under siege, so many left. What is the significance of having election at this very particular moment?
Well, as I just pointed out, at least three aspects are very clear. But internally also, I think this is a kind of statement that now bygones are bygones and that I have triumphed. And that was an indication. Remember, the people who are trapped in Idlib, they were not allowed to vote. I have already mentioned that the refugees are not allowed to vote. Then it is only a message that I am popular, especially because these elections were held only in the Assad-controlled areas. So the message was very clear that I have triumphed. If you want to work with Syria, you'll have to work with me. It seems to be a political, self-serving kind of policy, but this is what it is.
Perfect. Mr. Shafaat, thank you for joining me in the program. How do you see this election and how do you think the West, particularly the United States, its allies, Europe and Israel, the neighboring country, is going to see the outcome of this election?
Well, the significance of this election, it's multiple. It has multiple dimensions. First, considering that this country has been in war for the last 10 years, and there are almost 150 million people displaced during this time. There's been almost 6 million people who have died already, and at one point, United Nations said that the catastrophe of war is at such a humongous level that they're unable to count the dead. But people were still suffering, and the war was still going on. But during past 2 years, since Assad, the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, have claimed victory over FSA and ISIS and all the other enemies which they were fighting against. The last 2 years, we have seen that Syrian regime has changed its dimension. They have concentrated more on rebuilding the image, which was significantly lost during the last 10 years. They have invited vloggers from all over the world, and they have been asking them to make vlogs about it. They have been celebrating. They have been celebrating their cuisine, their bars, their heritage sites. They're laying railway lines all across the Syria. Domestic flights have resumed. So all this indicates to the common man in Syria that Bashar is back on track, and probably that's why that's the reason why Bashar was.
But Shafaat, my question, thank you. This was very insightful, Shafaat. But my question specifically is how United States, Europe, and the neighboring ally of United States, Israel, is going to take it.
Well, see, practically, if you see that Israel has targeted Damascus and the areas associated along with it quite a number of times, in fact, more than 22 times in past 2 years. That has actually given Bashar more strength and more of a public acclaim, and it has been counterproductive for Israelis and all the neighboring countries who see Bashar as the axis of all the problems in Syria. So right now, what I see and what I believe in my limited vision, that this crisis, like you said, that if Bashar has given a clear message that if you want an influence in Syria, if you want to talk about Syria, talk to me. Just recently, we have seen Russia banning an aid, all the Western aid coming in Syria. And that's a very serious implication. So that actually shows that Bashar is in close ties with Russia. Bashar is in the game and he's not going anywhere.
Farrukh Saab, I'm coming back to you. So we saw in last 2 to 3 years, particularly, when Donald Trump came in and spared some time, and then he realized also that United States should start, withdrawing itself from all these international engagements. We saw a big leap in Afghanistan being winded up as a project. Even in Syria, there is a very little presence of the American boots on ground. We just heard from our participant from New York who commented on my question and said that there are even concerns for Americans to drill oil from there. Government wants them to get out. How long do you think in all these circumstances the Americans are going to stand on ground and going to support the factions that they have been supporting so far, particularly when Assad is today holding more than 75% of the land holding of the country?
Right. And I'm going to respond to that, but allow me to actually butt in regarding the question you just asked. On May 26, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and the US have issued a joint statement, actually a very biting statement, condemning this election and calling it a farce. So that actually shows you how much impatient the West is. But the problem at this moment is that the neighbors of this country, of Syria, are actually exhausted of all these conflicts. And you understand that when it comes to Arab countries, most of the leadership is not elected, right? Actually, the Arab Spring went against them as well. So at this moment, we know that Bahrain and UAE have opened or reopened their embassies in Damascus. When you talk about the U.S., one thing is clear. Excuse me. Donald Trump's policy was astounding. He actually betrayed people who were aligned with the U.S. I'm talking about Kurds. The Kurdish population, their militias, were given a very small, little warning, and then the U.S. actually vacated the area, and the Turks actually came in. So the way the U.S. is handling it, the policy is not consistent. First, it was Obama administration, which was very aggressive and wanted to actually invade, but his actually attempts were defeated by his own Congress. Then Donald Trump came. His policy was not consistent at all. It was more placating Russia, Turkey, and other elements of the region. And now you have Biden administration, which has just taken over. At this moment, it is watch and see. But as I pointed out, that the Russia-led constitutional committee project still continues. So there is a possibility of a multilateral engagement where there is a possibility that something will be done. But at this moment, the humanitarian cost, the humanitarian effects are horrible. Earlier, your other panelist was telling you that the common man on the street thinks that things are back to normal. A shawarma actually costs something like 50,000 Syrian pounds. Just imagine how expensive life must be at this moment. So the life is really ravaged. At this moment, humanitarian aid is needed, but there's already a war fatigue and a relief fatigue because of the refugees who actually went to Europe, and you saw that there was a backlash. And in the U.S. as well, there was a backlash. So at this moment, it seems that regardless of what happens, Assad is going to stay. And while he is inevitable, his policies are really going to further hurt the Syrian people.
Got it, Farrukh. Shafaat, the intensity of war in Syria, has it come down a bit with different sides being defeated? We see ISIS that was holding ground for so long is now at the very end of the map. and the stakeholders, some of them have made rounds, some of them have lost rounds. So do you think the intensity of war has diluted over a period of time?
I think what Syria is going through right now is the media fatigue. The crisis is still there, the war is still there, but I think people are just too tired of reporting it and too tired of probably understanding it. So that's what actually is going on. And that's primarily the reason why Assad regime has been making use of it, making use of this media fatigue. The crisis is far from over. At Turkish borders, we see hundreds and thousands of refugees still waiting for their turns to, cross the border. And there still have been families whose business is far from over. They still don't have any hope left in their life. Across the northern side, if you have any Syrian map in mind, if you think of Idlib and Aleppo, the Halab and Idlib, if you go beyond that, the crisis is still there. In the Kurdish area, the crisis is still going on. But what Bashar has done in these elections is, again, he has made use of that media fatigue. He has voted in Doma, which is a suburban town of Damascus. Now, this has a very valid implication. Doma was the city which was once the stronghold of FSA and ISIS. They shared power there together. There had been numerous attacks on government officials, and there have been a suicide blast over there in 2012, probably, where half of the cabinet, Bashar's cabinet, was killed. So he is making use of that thing. But in actual, if you go to the numbers, if you go to the correspondence over there, if you go to the people living in Turkey or Beirut reporting from there, they have a different story to tell. And they tell that the crisis is still far from over.
Farrukh Saab, coming back to you, where does Turkey stand in this picture? And why I'm saying that is that we see the relationship between Turkey and the United States are on a downhill. The Russians have made very firm ground in Syria, as we discussed earlier. Would Turkey be happy of Russia getting such a strong presence in the Mediterranean, with its naval presence intensifying with each passing day?
Right. And that is a very good question. Remember, there was a time when Turkey actually shot down a Russian plane, and that actually gave us a moment to think as if the world war is going to start. It didn't happen. After that incident, and after an ambassador was also killed in Turkey, after that, both sides have actually worked together. And because of that, their cooperation has been increasing. At this moment, when you talk about Assad, the many countries that are actually supporting him, you can say that Russia and Iran support him. And then, of course, China is also always ready to work with every country. But Turkey has also been very supportive. A, because of the refugees, B, also because it has interest and it wants to actually play a regional role. So Turkey is going to be relevant and it is going to bolster. And we still have to see how this inclusion in Arab League dynamic actually plays out. Because, that there are various regional groupings. One is clearly Arab, the other is Iran-dominated, and then there's Turkey. Turkey actually aligns more with Iran these days. And remember, even Israel wants Bashar al-Assad to stay there because of one lesson that has been learned from various other countries like Libya and even Iraq, that if you have an authoritarian leader, if you remove him, there's no certainty who is going to succeed him and what exactly is going to happen. Already the world has gone through the ISIS phase. So at this moment, Turkey will work with Bashar al-Assad, but the pressure that will come from Russia, it will come from the US, it will come from Europe, but the other countries, the regional countries, it seems, are going to placate Assad.
And Farrukh Saab, how do you think things going forward from here? Because Assad has gained grounds in war. Assad has again won the election. Okay, whatever kind of elections these were. As you mentioned yourself, you said the Arabian states are also recalculating their alignments. Some states have sent the congratulations message. Some are reopening their embassies. So with Assad going forward all out, another thing that I missed is the OIC's membership of Syria is about to be restored after a gap of 10 years. How do you think the future will can be forecasted or can be seen in context of the behavior of the other states from the Arabian Peninsula? Do you think they are going to get back on table with the same regime?
Right. Actually, you said what kind of election. So there's a very quick measure of what kind of election it was. The number of vote casts were double the amount or double the number of total registered voters. The running joke is that even Assad's two opponents, the state-sanctioned opponents, even they voted for him, not for themselves. But regardless of that, the circumstances are such. One really actually worries about the Syrian people. Heart really goes out to them. We have seen some horrible pictures coming from Syria in the past 10 years. But at this moment, it seems that it is Syria, Assad's, pitch to bat on, and he is going to decide what kind of circumstances there are going to be. If there is going to be resistance to him, he has shown you already how brutal he can be and how many people he can kill. We have seen that there are allegations that his regime has disappeared somewhere around 100,000 people, right? The dissenters. And we have seen that they pursue people to the bitter end. So at this moment, if the opposition and if the fight continues, then we are going to see more suffering, and it will continue indefinitely. But what I think is going to happen is in coming days, the Constitutional Committee will find a work around on this matter, and which is actually an external de facto parliament. So if that has any say, there will be some kind of political agreement or some kind of settlement. I fear that it will see Assad at the top of affairs, and through that, perhaps the reconstruction and some kind of humanitarian aid will start flowing in. If that happens, at least there might be some respite for the war-ravaged Syrian people.
And Shafaat, how do you see the future of Syria from this point onward, say for about next 5 to 10 years?
We don't know about it. Being very honest, the Syrian crisis right now is at a virtual equilibrium. We have Kurdish forces in Raqqa, we have jihadists in Idlib, and we have rebellion forces beyond Aleppo. So it's some sort of an equilibrium, and I think it's going to stay that way for a very long time. Right now, the situation in the whole Middle East is going to suffer. That's what I see because of these elections. This time they hold the value. There have been elections twice during this whole civil war, but this time they're going to value because the war is claimed by SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, that it's over. There's no sign of FSA. There's no sign of ISIS now. There is a little bit of resistance presence in the southern Syria, but that's not going to be a problem. So yes, we can easily say that that Syria is right now at a political equilibrium. If that's the right term to use. Syria from this point on is, it's brandishing an image in which it shows itself as one of the recovered states from the Arab Spring. It didn't get. It did get a civil war because of that, but they were unable to topple him because of that. So I think they're going to brand it, and that's how we see Assad staying for a very long time.
Thank you very much, Shafaat. Thank you very much, Mr. Farrukh Pitafi, for being in my show. Ladies and gentlemen, Syria is the largest human crisis of our times. This war is going on for over 10 years. How many children, how many lives have been lost in this war? Nobody knows. And still, The Syrian government is not in control of the entire country. Let's hope for the best and hope that the Assad administration starts looking toward its own people in a sympathetic manner. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.